Welcome back to Meet in the Middle. I've got a couple of guests in the studio today. We're going to be talking about DUI first-time offenders, crucify or coddle. That is actually the topic of tomorrow's Columbia Basin Badger Club. And if you're not familiar with them, basically what the Badger Club does is they think of a topic. They get speakers to take positions on those topics. So the club itself, they say, never takes a side, but the speakers do. So the speakers often present their position on something, and then it's open to members to be able to discuss it and ask questions. Tomorrow's Badger Club meeting is at noon. It's a luncheon. That's October 29th. It's at the Shiloh Inn in Richland. Starts at 11:30. I'll tell you the day of tickets are $30, and that's at the door. But if you want to get pre-tickets and everything, basically you're going to go to ColumbiaBasinBadgers.com. So the DUI first-time offenders is the topic for tomorrow. In the studio we have Brian Roach. Brian is a local attorney here. He's been practicing, I think you told me, Brian, 14 years. His practice today is 100% DUI. So he's got a lot of experience handling those kinds of cases. And Diana Ruff is a deputy prosecutor in Benton County. And Diane has handled a lot of DUI cases, but not so much anymore, as I understand it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, but you've had plenty of experience, and I know that you've formed your own opinions on it as well. Brian, and there was a really, really good layout in the newspaper that kind of showed both positions. That was in Sunday's newspaper, kind of as a way to promote Badger Club. And Brian, you spent a lot of time in your article basically describing a first-time typical offender. Her name was Jane. Tell us more about this first-time offender.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be on the program here. I guess in preparation for this, I actually put a list together of the last 3 or 4 or 5 months worth of individuals who have walked in my door to hire me to defend them against this charge of driving under the influence. And it's interesting to point out that not are they just only Jane, but I've got folks that are mental health therapists, disabled, engineers, firefighters, managers of various businesses, college students. And so if you kind of look through the list, I think it would demonstrate that this is a crime that cuts across almost every kind of socioeconomic sector of society. And as I mentioned in that article, and I'll mention it here, the truth is that the vast majority of these individuals who are charged with DUI are experiencing the criminal justice system for the first and the last time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Diana, from your perspective, what do first-time offenders face?
Well, it depends on if DUI is their first criminal offense or if they have prior non-DUI criminal offenses. But at the misdemeanor level, and DUI is classified as a gross misdemeanor in the state of Washington, it ranges anywhere from a mandatory minimum of 24 consecutive hours in jail and a minimum fine up to the maximum, which is 364 days in jail and a $5,000 fine.
That's for a first-time offender? They can get that?
That's a possibility.
Okay.
The reality is, I think statewide, you'd be hard-pressed to find a first-time offender facing the maximum. If they hurt someone or killed someone, it would not be a gross misdemeanor. It would be at the felony level. So really, if you're talking about your average Jane, as Brian described in his article, they'd be looking at, depending on the circumstances, again, that minimum of 24 hours in jail, and around a $700 fine. Some of the fines vary by jurisdiction, but the 24-hour mandatory minimum does not vary statewide. I think on average in Benton and Franklin County, you're going to see someone who gets the imposition of 24 hours in jail, and the mandatory minimum fines. There's also mandatory costs, court costs that go along with that. There's a mandatory evaluation for substance abuse and mandatory victims impact panel. And those victim impact panels are classes where offenders go and listen to victims of DUIs, family members of victims of DUIs, who talk about how DUI has affected their life. Maybe it took a loved one from them. Maybe it paralyzed a loved one, something like that. So those are some of the incidental consequences that face everyone. And that 24 hours in jail, Brian mentioned in his article, people are facing additional jail time. I guess often what that might mean is you're booked in on a Friday night, you get out on Saturday, you haven't done 24 consecutive hours. Maybe you were in for 8 hours, maybe you were in for 12 hours. The statute says you must do 24 consecutive hours. And that's for someone with a blood alcohol content of below a 0.15. So your average Jane, who is below a 0.15, is going to be looking at 1 day, essentially, in jail plus fines. And if they have hired an attorney, obviously those are incidental costs as well of paying your attorney. You're going to miss time from work because you're going to have to leave work and come to court at 8 in the morning or 1 in the morning. You're going to need to meet with your attorney. Those are all costs to the offender that they might not be thinking of. But that's why we see commercials on television that say even your first DUI can cost you $5,000 to $10,000, and that's not a joke. That's a reality, and that's an expense that is and should be borne by the defendant or the person who is either charged with or guilty of a DUI.
And what about the devices that don't allow you to start the car without, you have to blow in and register something on this breathalyzer for the car. I mean, are those required on first-time offenders?
They can be. I think Brian can talk more to that. Brian is
Sure.
more familiar with what I would call the back end of a DUI, the consequences. But yes, ignition interlocks can be and are required even with a first-time conviction to be installed in your car, or you can do it, I would say, quote-unquote, voluntarily while your license is suspended, while your case is still pending, if you want to drive during the period of mandatory suspension. But that's actually a Department of Licensing consequence, not necessarily a criminal consequence. So there's both civil and criminal consequences to being arrested for and charged with DUI.
Wow, whew. It's a long list.
And I think I can probably just add, as it relates to that ignition interlock device discussion, that there are some ironies there. The law is now, and has been for several years anyway, that every single DUI conviction requires an interlock for a certain period of time. If you're on a first offense, it's at least 1 year. If it's a refusal first offense, you're probably going to want to have it for 2 years so you can drive throughout that time frame. That would otherwise be a suspension. And then it goes 5 and 10 in a lifetime. So there's no look-back window of 7 years. It's a 1, 5, 10 in a lifetime. The thing I wanted to point out that I think is a bit of an irony, and I'll give a simple example. I've represented individuals who come from a faith where they don't consume alcohol at all, but unfortunately got into an accident, had prescription medication on board, and faced the potential of being convicted for a non-alcohol related offense for a person who has never consumed alcohol in their life, and would be required, if he or she were convicted, which incidentally he or she was not convicted, would be required to have that interlock device in their car for a year to protect against drinking and driving when it had nothing to do with it.
Okay, so it's a requirement that can't be altered. So
That's correct.
that's your only one example.
Example of what?
That the law is not very.
Flexible.
There you go. Thank you. Thank
One
you,
question
John.
I wanted to bring up too, and I know this because someone that I know suffered a first offense, and having watched and seen what they went through, I personally felt, and I don't know that this is necessarily the situation with the courts, but I'm going to go on the record as saying I believe the people that supply the breathalyzer equipment for the vehicles, the interlocks, I believe that is a great big fat racket. And I believe that $250, $300 to put it in, $250 to $300 to get it out. I know automotive guys that said no. And while we need stiff penalties, what are your thoughts on the fact that especially you have a person of generally good character that makes a mistake, a first-time offender, and it appears to me that in some ways you could argue that these people are being financially destroyed because the law. And I don't want anybody out there to think that it's okay to drink and drive. I'm just saying that I think that the whole system, here comes the 2x4 upside your head financially, and often it sends these people into such a tailspin. When you destroy someone financially, you only dig them a deeper hole they can't get out of. But I think that I think that those people that do interlock machines, I'll go on the record as saying I think it's a big fat racket, and I think they're making money hand over fist unnecessarily.
I can respond to that. I tend to agree with you. It's interesting to note who were the players in the front end of this in requiring, in most states, for a first offense to have the interlock device, and they were attorneys. They were folks that knew that there could be some money to be had in this business, and that it was a trend that nobody was, or a train that nobody was going to stop. I mean, folks out there, when they hear DUI and hear the carnage associated with DUI, as the word often is used, I mean, there's no stopping that train. I brought a statistic here. If you go to the legislative website and just for bills, resolutions, passed legislation, amendments, resolutions, and you search through all those, since 1990, there are over 1,000 different search query results for DUI, or the statute that relates to DUI. And so we're constantly focusing on the tragedy that could come from a DUI, and unnecessarily, I think, disproportionately punishing those that are likely statistically to never be back in the system again.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a break here, but before we do, let me share with you some statistics that Diana had in her article. 10,000 people in the year 2013. That's not that long ago. 10,000 people in our nation died at the hands of a DUI driver. In 2014, 149 people in the state of Washington died. 34% of all traffic deaths are related to DUI. That's a third of traffic deaths, DUI, preventable. Let's look in Benton and Franklin counties. 15 DUI deaths in the year 2014, last year. 59 serious crashes.